Welcome to the Hourly Podcast. In today's episode, Dr. Kathy Gosser, a college professor and former executive at KFC, discusses her passion for franchising and the importance of training and retention within the hourly workforce. She shares her experience in developing training programs and the challenges of balancing efficiency and engagement. Dr. Gosser also highlights key factors that contribute to employee retention, including workload and fair treatment. She addresses the impact of joint employer regulations on franchisors and the need for universities to provide education on people practices within the franchise model. Enjoy.
This episode is brought to you by JoJo, an AI virtual recruiter powered by Sprockets. Designed for the hourly workforce, JoJo works 24/7 to source, screen, and schedule interviews with the best applicants for your business. JoJo helps reduce employee turnover and time spent hiring so you and your team can focus on other important tasks. To learn more, head to sprockets.ai/JoJo.
Thank you, Dr. Kathy Gosser, for being on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I see a lot of Louisville stuff in your background. For those of you,
there's my Cardinals, and then there's obviously KFC, my alma mater.
I love it. So, with that in mind, for our listeners, tell us a little bit about you. Give us your background and why you love franchising so much.
Sure. Well, it's a long background, so I'll spare you a little bit of it. But I started at KFC in the 80s. We'll just leave it at that, even though I retired after 35 years. So I started as a mystery shopper, and I thought, oh, gosh, this is great. I had a journalism degree. Times were bad, but I thought, how great I get to travel the country and visit these restaurants and tell them what I'm seeing, So I was able to tell them what they were doing with quality service and cleanliness. And it was a great job for a recent college graduate. I mean, just like the best job. So when they hired me, they said, you'll only be here for a year and a half or 2 years. Well, that was a surprise because I ended up staying there my entire life. And along the way, just got to do a lot of great things, from leading customer satisfaction programs to actually leading restaurants for a year, to food safety audits, back of house audits. And my last 7 years were spent working with training, leading the training organization, as well as organizational development, and being the chair of a wonderful charity they have there, the KFC Foundation. So it was a career dreams are made of. And from there, I decided I always wanted to be a professor when I grew up. So I'd gotten a lot of education along the way. And so then I started at the University of Louisville teaching franchise management. And now we have franchise management certificates at the graduate, undergraduate, non-credit, and we have a center, the Yum Brands Center for Global Franchise Excellence. So all well and good. A lot.
So is that program through University of Louisville?
Yes, it's through the University of Louisville. Absolutely.
Got it. Because I know just through meeting some interesting people and just being from the Northeast myself, Babson has a franchise institute as well. Like, are there a lot of schools that kind of have this program? Is it emerging? Like, what's your view on that?
I love the word emerging because that's what I think it is. And it's my goal. The reason I'm in this encore career, it's my goal that everyone understands all the opportunities available in franchising, whether that's working for a franchisee, a franchisor, a partner. There's just, so many opportunities. And so my friends at Babson also have great education. Palm Beach Atlantic has something, University of Denver, the University of Nebraska, a lot of different colleges have courses here and there. And we are all trying to work together to really bring education to the masses, because I call myself the accidental franchise executive. I had no idea that I would be in this for as long as I've been in it.
Yeah, I love it. And when you said earlier, you said training, right? Is it training individual team members? Is it training people at corporate? Is it training franchisees? What did it mean within your career?
I was lucky because it meant all of the above.
Okay,
So
wow.
I led a team. We called ourselves Team Awesome. They were fantastic. So we would create the training for all new products. So for all team members across the U.S. So at the time we had between 4,200 and 4,400 restaurants. So if you had a new sandwich, for example, we provided all the training for all the hourly team members. We also did leadership development training for managers as well as people at headquarters. So we had the opportunity to do training at all levels. I even had a chance to hold training for the C-suite. So really a nice range of training.
Yeah. And the purpose of this podcast, talk about primarily the hourly workforce, right? The people on the front lines that make all of our lives possible and make our lives better. I'm curious, when you build policy and procedure for the hourly workforce, right? Like, how do you get a pulse for if it's going to be challenging, if it's really deviation from the current process, and how do you roll that out effectively when you have something new?
And that's a good question. And that's a constant challenge. And one of the things is you're balancing the fact that you can't have training that takes too long, because
Right.
then you will have your franchisee partners who are concerned about the cost of it. So I had a franchisee once tell me how many thousands a minute of training cost. And so but you know what? That's real. And you have to think about that. So the training has to be valuable. So we did a couple things, like we tried some gamification, which caused some problems because it took extra time. So
Right.
there's a balance between making it engaging as well as making it efficient and short. So thinking about all of those. And so we would do, we branded our training. So if it was a simple rollout of a product, the best way to do a lot of that is video. And so you can just show how to make a product. I don't know if you remember those old videos where they didn't even use words. They would just show how to do it. We would do a lot of those where, can you just show how to make a sandwich? Can you just assemble it? And you can show that in 30 seconds. It's so fast. And so we did a lot of video work. We did a lot of animations, things that made it engaging, but that people understood this is what it's about. And then, of course, you have to have job support. You have to have documents that are on the job that help provide coaching in the moment, if you will. But it was definitely always a challenge.
Yeah, especially because, average tenure in the QSR space right now is very small, right? Like you're
That's
seeing
right.
people stay between 55 and 110 days on average,
Hmm.
right? 90-day retention, 73% annual turnover being 150, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot of daunting things. And, when you're building new process, how much of it is retraining old people who have been there
Hmm.
for a long time versus just adding to the training of new employees in a cycle that constantly repeats and a workforce that constantly changes. Like, how do you think of that?
Well, actually, 150% would have sounded good some days for turnover, because
Yeah.
I've seen restaurants that would go 2 to 300%.
Right. Right.
But that is a balance. And so we would do a number of things like back to basics, where we would retrain everyone on like all the cooks on how do you make perfect chicken, for example. But when there's a new product, you have to think about everyone has to learn it in the same way, right? Because you have to be consistent. The part about a franchise is that you're providing a consistent product. And so it is a challenge, because with retention, it's an interesting dynamic. On the one hand, retention can be fantastic if you're retaining the right employees. So there are times that I think that some turnover might be necessary. But when it comes to training, new products were easy because you're training everyone. But when it comes to recertifying, folks get into bad habits and they keep those. So that is a challenge all the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? It's like every single time someone turns over, it's a chance to kind of refresh with
Yeah,
better habits, is what you're saying,
correct.
right?
Correct.
And like
Yeah.
it's an interesting perspective. And what I'm finding too, just in the field, is although it's 200% annual turnover, it's usually the 40% that turns over 500% of the time,
That's right.
and it's the 60% that turns over 10%. Like
That's
what
right.
I call lovingly like the lifers, right?
That's
Like
right.
the people who love what they do, clock in, clock out,
Mhm.
are happy,
Mhm.
and I suspect that they probably are just accustomed to new trainings as they come through because they've
Mhm.
been around the block. So like if I'm a quick service restaurant employee, how often am I getting new training? Like give us some perspective
Mhm.
of like, is this every week, every month, like every year? How's that go?
It's probably every 6 weeks.
Six.
Especially in the competitive world of quick service restaurants, you have to have new products in, or a new procedure or a new promotion or something. So it's probably around every 6 to 8 weeks you're getting some type of new training. Now, a lot of brands will say, "Let's go back to basics," and once a year everybody retrains on everything. So it really depends, of course, and then you have the ongoing coaching. But I like what you said about, you call them lifers. I used to call them the core team members.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, though. And so those core team members are extremely important, because you can write the best training in the world, but they're the ones who have the influence. So
Mhm.
knowing what are they teaching people and how
Right.
are they being encouraged, rewarded, et cetera, is important as well.
Yeah, and I'm surprised that like a big brand, a storied, staple brand like KFC
Mhm.
has training that often. to be
Oh,
honest with
yeah.
you, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I think of it like emerging brand that is changing the menu, trying to figure out product market fit, make sure that they're trying different vendors of food, trying to figure out how to make things more efficient. But KFC don't strike me just based on their age to be constantly innovating. But what you're telling me is that's the complete opposite. I'm horribly misinformed, is what
I
you're
mean,
saying.
that is absolutely the opposite. We were constantly putting different types of training out, different types of
Mm.
development. I love that about all of Yum Brands is they're very innovative and very forward thinking on let's make sure we're developing our workforce. Let's have the best workforce we can have. So we were extremely busy.
Right,
Yes.
right. And I'm gonna use what I will say is like the A word, right? The automation word, right? And I think there's always a temptation from big organizations to develop process and procedures that require less human touch,
Mhm.
right? And what's been really interesting for me is going to trade shows, seeing robotics be able to flip burgers and do certain things, but it really hasn't had widespread adoption, right? There's some outliers like the Sweet Greens that went entirely autonomous at some
Mhm.
locations, but for some reason, it just feels like this industry hasn't like really taken that on that quickly. At least in the back of house. Now we're seeing more kiosks, right, replacing the cashiers. Like,
Mhm.
what are some of your thoughts on that? Am I wrong? Like, what's your general philosophy there?
I think that I don't think you're wrong. I think when you look at a large brand and you start to multiply what automation would cost by the number of units they have, it's
Mm,
pretty astronomical. So that's one of your first barriers. Also, you want to make sure it's something that's going to work. And let's take AI. AI is fascinating, and that's what a lot of people are using up front. And it is fascinating. It's not all the way proven. It will one day. It will in my lifetime, I'm sure. But I'll give you an example of what like Pizza Hut's doing that I just think is phenomenal. And they've reported this. I'm not telling a trade
yeah.
secret. They actually are using AI to evaluate pizzas that come out of the oven to ensure they hit their quality standards. Now, I'm
Mm,
wowed by that
yeah.
because number one, I do think AI could do that more consistently than the human eye could do. So for me, that is like, okay, I would get that in because then you can be sure you have great product. But
Mm,
I think that it's just the sheer size of the organization makes it tough. And one of the things I really want to make sure I make a note of is I did my dissertation on the predictors of intent to stay of the hourly employee, and it was several years ago. However, I would argue that what I found is still true because people will typically say, "Oh gosh, it's the pay, it's this or it's that," and part of it was how the managers treated them. But the biggest predictor of intent to stay in the sample I had of over 900 employees across the country was workload. And workload was not simplifying the back of house, which is what you may be thinking of. Oh, it's so hard. It is hard.
right.
It is hard to make chicken. I get that. It is hard to make pizzas. That wasn't the issue. After I finished the dissertation, did some focus groups and found out the issue was really people call off or you don't schedule enough people. So
Mm,
I have to do the job of two. And that's the bigger issue, but that's the tougher issue to tackle. Finding automation is almost a simpler route than dealing with the human element of getting people to show up when they're on the schedule or understanding that I realize labor is a huge cost, but I also realize I have to have enough people to work so the others don't feel so frustrated. So I still think that's a relevant finding, but
yep.
it's not something you hear a lot of people talking about. I was shocked to find it just to be honest.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've sent you a book yet. I'll get you it. It has a lot of studies around the reasons that people leave, and I don't know if that's talked about at length. So I'm gonna have to pick your brain more on that at later. I'm curious, what other findings did you have? Like, do you remember what 2 and 3 were, 4 and 5,
Sure.
anything like that?
Sure. So I use the theory of organizational justice, which is fairness.
Yep.
And so that was the theory that I was testing. So I'm sure there are others. So just know that it was in the confines of
Yep.
organizational justice. And so another issue was that the manager treated everyone the same with the same kindness and respect, and that procedures were applied the same. So for example, if you're late to work, you're treated exactly the same as I am if I'm late to work. And that's
Yep.
called procedural justice. And there's a lot of issues with that. So those were the top ones. scheduling and pay were a little bit farther down the road, as they typically are.
Yeah.
They tend to show up in the middle. So, but I was pretty fascinated when workload came out. We checked those numbers over and over, and it was pretty interesting. And if you just talk to people, they'll talk to you about, gosh, if people just show up, if Joe would have just shown up, this would have been an easier shift. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And what would you say, because it's the number two is like blowing my mind right now, right? Is like when you treat people, everyone the same, regardless of who they are, how long they've been there. You saying that's bad for retention?
No, I'm saying it's good.
Oh, okay. It's
bad for turnover. So if you don't treat everyone the same, yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. I thought you were going to say like, hey, we were going to get into like a multi-generational workforce and you have to treat Gen Zs and Gen Alphas a little bit differently than boomers, but no, all very, very interesting. And what do you think, in hearing how storied storied like your entire career has been, the work that you've done, what drives you to do this, right? Did you wake up and when you were 15, you're like, hey, I want to make a life of understanding this problem? Did you learn to love it? Like, talk to me about that.
So, as I said, I'm the accidental franchise executive. So I started as that mystery shopper, and then I just really loved all my different roles at KFC and Yum, the opportunities that were provided. And when I ran restaurants, so I ran 10 restaurants in 2001.
Yep.
And that's when I really developed a passion for the team members working inside the restaurants. And I thought, these are really hard jobs and underappreciated. And when I get back to corporate, I'm going to do all I can to help make a difference here. So when it came time, I got an MBA, and then when it came time to choose a dissertation topic when I was working on my PhD, it was the natural one for me, is I wanted to find out, why do people stay? Because we were struggling. Everybody's been struggling with employee retention for 20, 30 years. This is not a new topic. So back in 2011, when I did the study, it was very relevant. So I just had a passion for the team members, and I loved my team members and the work they did. I so appreciated. And so I wanted to find more and help them. And to Yum Brands and KFC's credit, we used that work to actually develop programs to make a difference.
Yeah. And what's interesting, in the book, I talk about this a lot, is how there is a bit of a dichotomy between, I think, the interest that people have in becoming franchisees and their ability or willingness to build people processes, right? So you kind of have like an inherent problem that people who join franchises, I think, inherently want a playbook of how to run it, right? Like, this is the logo, these are the menu items, this is the food we serve, here's some light pricing instruction, and you come under our umbrella. And because you do those things, rather than starting AJ's Pizza Shop, we'll give you the infrastructure and support to scale your business and be successful. Like, I'm bought in. That's awesome, right? And so that attracts a certain type of person that when, you start talking about developing people practices, hiring practices, there's like the ultimate line there that's like, nope, joint employer, we can't help you with those specific things.
That's right.
So you have a group of people pre-wired for a process, and then in the most important, arguably, part of the business, corporate's handcuffed. And what I've learned just through dealing with amazing people at like RBI and Inspire Brands, I don't know the Yum folks, but I'm sure they're fantastic too, is no matter how much amazing work they do and procedures they build, there is limits to what they can give to the franchisees, right? And what's your reaction to all of that? And what are some things that corporate can, in fact, do to have an impact in the store level for the franchisees?
And you have just described what drove me crazy for years, because joint employer does handcuff many wonderful franchisors, right? So you can do a couple things through best practice, or you can offer suggestions on where they could get leadership training, or you could call something optional. So there are those types of ways that you can still stay within the boundaries, if you will, within the guardrails. But it is a frustration. So I think that's too why, like, universities like Babson and myself, we now teach the franchise model. And within my certificate, I have an HR course and a leading franchise teams course, because I know that I couldn't teach that. So it's like you have to go elsewhere. And that's too bad, but I don't see that changing.
Yeah, and I'm looking up like when joint employer went into effect, because you may have
I dealt with that. Yeah,
Yeah, you saw both sides. You saw before
I
and
did.
after my employer, right? Talk
I
to me about
did.
that. What was that like?
Well, I wasn't leading training at that time, but I know that there were a lot more offerings to the franchisees. But when I started leading training, we really had to be very, very careful. And there are reasons for that. I totally understand why. And even things like harassment training, you can't really provide to your franchisees because that could be that
Yeah.
can drive a joint employer because you're interacting with the day-to-day activities. So it is frustrating. Franchisees don't really understand it either a lot of times.
Right.
So it's you have to do some education on why you can't provide it instead of just looking like I don't want to help you. So I do think that it is an issue. Of course, right now the current NLRB rule was struck down and it looks like they're not going to appeal that. So, but still, because it's so because it's so ambivalent, it's always changing. Most people will go to the conservative side and just not do a lot. Just try to
Uh,
stay very clean.
let's rewind there because I want to understand what you said about NLRB. So, like,
Mhm.
from your perspective, do you think over time they'll be joint employer long term, or do you think there's a possibility that that gets pulled out?
I think what we have today is what we have today. I would be surprised with all the current rulings, especially with the SCOTUS just coming back with the Chevron ruling. I'd be surprised if NLRB tries to force that anymore. But I think it is where it is right now, which is if you are demonstrating direct control of employees in a particular unit, you are a joint employer. Now, obviously, all the recent rulings got rid of the indirect control, which was scary to the franchise model because
Right.
there is indirect control just because you need it. I mean, procedures, policies, standards. That is
Uniforms.
indirect control, right?
Uniforms alone. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Product. So I think that since they got rid of that, I don't see them coming back to that with all the with the new SCOTUS
Yeah.
uh
So you
report. I
feel
don't
like what we have now will prolong for a reasonable amount of time.
I think so.
Yeah.
And that's just an opinion.
And
But
is there like repercussions or potential ramifications of this election cycle that if one person were to win, it either put it more at risk or less at risk?
I don't know because I think the Chevron ruling supersedes all of that.
Yeah.
And I think there are some probably bigger fish to fry at the moment.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And
Um,
the fact that the NLRB, sorry to interrupt you, but dropped their appeal is really telling.
yeah. Yeah. I'm just always amazed of like how big franchising is in the American economy, right? It's what 3% GDP runs through
Exactly.
the franchise model, right? So,
Exactly.
and I think it's 6 million workers. I could be wrong. We'll have to fact check that.
I think
Do you
it's
know?
over 8 million. Not that I'm trying to fact check you now, but
No,
it's
20%
a
wrong. I'm in
lot.
the ballpark though. I'm in the ballpark.
You're in the ballpark. Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's like that law I know was very jarring for operators that I've been working with too, where they felt like the support system that they bought into kind of went away, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they understandably so want support in this area. But to your
Sure.
point, franchisors I think have started to do a good job now that it's settling to really like build a framework of what they can do, can't do, and it's less personal like hey I won't help to here's a complete list of things you can do to get help, where
Mhm.
in the beginning I think it was a little bit hair on fire, right?
Mhm.
We're trying to figure this out as you go, but no, super interesting. We're coming up on our time. Kathy, I really, really appreciate the conversation today. We'll have to do a part 2 and part 3 in the future.
Uh-huh.
Talk to me because I do ask the same question at the end of every single podcast. It's what was, and I think I know after talking to you, but what was your first ever job? And did you quit or were you fired from that job?
Oh, my first ever job, I worked at a library in high school. And how I got it was they weren't hiring at the time. And I wanted the job so badly that my Girl Scout leader said, "Why don't you offer 80 free hours for a badge?" And I did. And after 80 hours, she hired me. And I actually left because I quit because I needed to make more money. So I went to be a server in a restaurant because I was going to college and I had to make money. Right. So
Yeah.
otherwise, I'll tell you what, I might still be there. I tend to stay places a long time, but it was a wonderful first job.
Wonderful. Well, if somebody wants to get in touch with you or learn more about the work that you do, is it a
Mhm.
website? Is it LinkedIn? What's the best way for them to do that?
Probably we have a web on LinkedIn. We have the Center for Global Franchise Excellence. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, and I love to have connections. And we also have we have our website at the University of Louisville, louisville.edu, and you could just put in the Center there and get right in.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much, Kathy, for joining the podcast. I loved it. I know our listeners will love it too. And we appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. Appreciate it.